this afternoon. Lawson Naidoo is the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. He previously worked as a Special Assistant to Dr. Jumane and Speaker of the National Assembly. He is a regular media commentator on constitutional and legal matters, and he holds his honorary from the University of Cambridge. So please welcome Lawson Naidoo.
Good afternoon to all of you for being here so late on a Friday afternoon. It's good to be here. Just been reminded that this is the 70th year of the summer school, so it's about time I made my debut, I think. What I want to talk about today is really about Parliament. As said, it's an institution that's very close to my heart, having worked there in the first democratic parliament from 94 to 99. And I think what's happened with the revelations around state capture is beginning to shine a spotlight on that institution. And I don't think that sufficient attention has been paid to that so far. A lot of the debate and discussion has been around capture of state institutions. We talk about the police, the NPA, the Hawks, SARS, and the like. And a lot of the focus has been there, and I don't think enough attention has been on Parliament. So that's really what I want to focus on today. And to start by saying that, we all are very proud that the South African Constitution is lauded as one of the most, as the best in its class globally. And I think this, stems from the fact that it bears the fruits of the struggle against apartheid, against colonialism, and it drew on the values of the liberation struggle and the North Star of that liberation struggle being the Freedom Charter. The Constitution, talks of a just and equitable social order that is based on human dignity. And it's those aspirations in our Constitution that has drawn the admiration from across the world. It's in particular the Bill of Rights in the Constitution that encompasses a set of socio-economic rights as well as fourth generation rights such as the right to a clean environment. The question of whether we have made strides towards achieving those goals is an issue for another day. For now and for today, I want to focus on the constitutional architecture in South Africa, the role of Parliament within that architecture, and the governance provisions in the Constitution. So just to remind ourselves, Section 1 of the Constitution says that South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values. A, human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. B, non-racialism and non-sexism. C, the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. And D, universal adult suffrage, a national common voters' roll, regular elections, and this is, I think, is the important part, a multi-party system of democratic government to ensure accountability, responsiveness, and openness. So that really sums up the kind of governance foundations that we have. So just very quickly, in addition to Chapter 2, which I've said is the Bill of Rights, and Chapter 1, the founding provisions, let's just run through very quickly what the other chapters of the Constitution deal with. So Chapter 3 deals with cooperative government, which is where it talks about how different tiers of government, national, local, and provincial, should work together. Chapter 4 deals with Parliament. We'll come back to that. Chapter 5 deals with the President and the National Executive. Chapter 6 with provincial government. Chapter 7 with local government. Chapter 8 deals with the courts and the administration of justice. Chapter 9 deals with, as we know, the state institutions supporting constitutional democracy, what we colloquially refer to as the Chapter 9 institutions. Chapter 10 deals with public administration. 11 with the security services, the armed forces, the police and the like. Chapter 12 with traditional leaders and traditional leadership. Chapter 13 deals with finance in some detail. And then Chapter 14 covers a few general provisions. So that's is in outline the structure of our founding document. I'm not going to, don't worry, I'm not going to deal with all of those chapters in any detail. I just wanted to give you an indication of the sort of architecture of the Constitution. What I want to highlight are the primary governance principles that underpin everything. The fact that there is a separation of powers between the three arms of the state and the checks and balances that exist within the Constitution. And I want to do so in the context, as I said, of the revelations around state capture, the Gupta leaks that came out in the middle of 2017, as well as the evidence that is being heard on a continual basis by the Zonda Commission. But our system of governance is unique, even though in our constitutional framework we drew from many other jurisdictions, the Canadian Constitution, the German, and when it comes to Parliament, from the British model of the Westminster system. So we have what I would call a mixed system with a presidential as well as a parliamentary system, but with an overarching constitution that is supreme. So we retain a Westminster style of parliament, and we don't directly elect our president. President, as we know, is elected by parliament. And in recent debates about electoral reform, which is an issue I'm going to come back to later in this discussion, there have been many calls for us to have a directly elected president. And I would certainly, for one, I would caution against such a move. I think we need look no further than the Trump impeachment saga in the US to see how difficult it is to remove a directly elected president. It proved difficult in South Africa to elect a president by parliament as well, but that's really the issue I want us to grapple with. So we have the separation of powers between the legislature, parliament, the executive, which is government, and the judiciary, which is underpinned by a requirement, but each sphere must adhere to the rule of law. And while the Constitution itself doesn't speak about separation of powers, doesn't refer to it in those terms, that principle is inherent in the Constitution, in the principle of constitutional supremacy that is established in that Constitution. What the Constitution does do is to set out the functions of each of those three arms, and that to say that they must act in accordance with their mandates and in accordance with the Constitution. To summarize, the power to legislate is given to Parliament, the National Assembly, and the National Council of Provinces. The power to develop and implement policy and to initiate legislation is given to the executive. And the power to adjudicate matters and conflicts is given to the courts. So in addition to passing legislation, Parliament also has a constitutional function to hold the executive and organs of state to account. And in that sense, it is the key institution within the system of checks and balances within the Constitution to hold public power to account. Parliament's oversight functions therefore allows MPs to oversee and monitor not just the executive, but organs of state as well, so such as the NPA, SARS, and the like. So within that framework of separation of powers, checks and balances, in theory, all should be well. But as we've come to learn, it isn't. MPs have clearly abdicated their responsibility, with the governing party using its majority to allow the executive to evade accountability. The Deputy Chief Justice Zondo has recently and repeatedly said that the Commission will have to consider the role of Parliament in facilitating or enabling state capture. And in an affidavit that he filed with the Pretoria High Court last month, a few days before Christmas, in an application where he is seeking to extend the term of the Commission of Inquiry to the end of 2020, he says in that affidavit, and I quote, "The Commission is also still looking into whether there was any failure by Parliament to properly perform its oversight obligations which may have contributed to the matter which the Commission is required to investigate." The idea is that, should the Commission conclude at the end of its work that there was state capture, it can then determine whether any failure by Parliament to properly perform its oversight obligations played any role in state capture and in allowing the levels of corruption and fraud in our country to reach the levels it has reached. Unquote. So we see that the Zondo Commission is clearly beginning to identify Parliament as a key player in state capture. Parliament itself has adopted an oversight and accountability model which recognizes that, unlike in the Westminster system, which is based on convention and custom, in South Africa, oversight is a constitutionally mandated function given to the legislature to scrutinize the executive. Again, this all sounds good in words, but if we examine even briefly what has transpired, the Fifth Parliament sat from June 2014 to May of last year, just before the May elections. And the first half of the tenure of that Parliament was largely characterized by a lack of or inadequate oversight. To start with, former President Jacob Zuma was re-elected as President by the National Assembly, despite the Public Protector's report on Nkandla having been released just a couple of months before that 2014 election in March of that year. In addition, the Speaker, Baleka Mbete, who also had the position at the time as chairperson of the governing party, was elected as Speaker of the National Assembly. And in my view, in many ways, these two appointments came to define the Fifth Parliament. As I said, the Constitution envisages the National Assembly to be a space that is imbued with the principles of multi-party democracy, which is representative, participatory, responsive, and accountable. I think it's clear to say that a vibrant opposition in the National Assembly is essential for accountable government. But that accountability function cannot be the sole preserve of opposition parties. The Constitution also says that eligibility for membership of the National Assembly is dependent on being a member of a political party and being on a list, electoral list for that political party. And then Section 47(3) says that that membership is conditional for being a member of the National Assembly. That's an issue that is currently being challenged in the Constitutional Court. There was a case that was heard last year brought by an organization called the New Nation Movement, seeking to argue that the Constitution permits independent candidates and individuals to stand for election to the National Assembly. That's a matter that we are awaiting judgment from the Constitutional Court on. But the eligibility criteria and the security of tenure that members of Parliament have with a view to their parliamentary careers really means that people have to retain their membership of the political party that nominated them to continue in that role. So it can be argued that the Constitution therefore limits the freedom of individual members to follow the dictates of their conscience and moral convictions and to act in pursuit of what is demanded of them by their political parties. And this is something that permeates all political parties. It's not unique to the governing party and to the ANC. We see it happening in other parties as well. Because members run the risk of facing disciplinary action and consequent dismissal by their party leadership in the event that they express opinions that differ from the party line. Yet despite this injunction in Section 1 about the multi-party democracy, the National Assembly is characterized by the practice of majoritarianism where numbers count, which has resulted in the narrowing of the space for debate. There are a number of cases that have been decided by the Constitutional Court, one or two of which I'll refer to shortly, which attest to this. Coming back to the former Public Protector Thuli Madonsela's report on Nkandla in 2014, we know that that investigation found that the President breached the executive member's code of ethics, which in turn resulted in him infringing his constitutional responsibilities and so on. The National Assembly then set up two ad hoc committees, one before the 2014 election, which dissolved at the time of the election, and another one shortly after those elections, to examine the Public Protector's report, as well as other reports, including the now infamous one compiled by the then Minister of Police, Nathi Nhleko, that sought to redefine what a fire pool is. As a result of that, members of opposition parties withdrew from the committee. They walked out, but because the ANC has an inbuilt majority because of the proportional representation in committees, there was still a quorum in the committee, so the committee with just ANC members was able to pass their report, which was then passed by the National Assembly. And after endorsing that report by the Minister of Police, they exonerated the President from any liability and basically absolved him of any responsibility. What the National Assembly effectively did was to create a parallel process to the Public Protector's report, and the only purpose of that parallel process was to circumvent the findings of the Public Protector. Now, we know that that case ultimately went to the Constitutional Court, and the court said that Parliament had acted unconstitutionally in seeking to do that. But the point I'm seeking to make is to show how the governing party in Parliament used its numerical advantage to shield the President from accountability. There are other cases relating to this, which I won't go into because I'd like to save time for discussion, but perhaps it's important to mention one other, which is a 2017 case, which is sort of a follow-up from the initial Nkandla case. And it's known as the EFF2 matter, where the EFF and one or two other opposition parties approached the Constitutional Court on the basis of the Constitutional Court's earlier judgment, asking for an order declaring that the Speaker of the National Assembly had failed to put all appropriate mechanisms and processes in place to hold Jacob Zuma accountable for violating the Constitution through the failure to implement the report of the Public Protector. The court therefore had to look at these issues and had to consider whether the National Assembly had indeed failed to hold the President to account following the Nkandla report and the court's judgment. Parliament argued that there were a number of question and answer sessions, that there had been motions of no confidence against Jacob Zuma, and that those actions showed that Parliament did indeed try to hold him to account, and that those measures should suffice to show that they had put in place mechanisms. The court disagreed and said that in terms of the impeachment provisions in Section 89, those question and answer sessions and the motion of no confidence didn't meet the standard required of Parliament in that regard, and said that Parliament should have properly conducted a preliminary inquiry to assess whether the President had indeed breached any of the grounds that would trigger the impeachment process. And by failing to do so, the court held that the National Assembly had again acted unconstitutionally and directed Parliament to put in place rules and procedures for an impeachment process, which we know that they have now done. But importantly, in rejecting what Parliament had done, the ad hoc arrangements that they had put into place, the court said a decision by members of the majority party in an ad hoc committee may prevent an impeachment process from proceeding beyond the committee to shield a president who is their party leader. And I think that quote sums up the problem that Parliament faces, is that the majority party is able to overcome any procedural issues that arise within Parliament. And the decision of this court therefore recognizes that the numerical dominance of political parties in Parliament can result in a loss of accountability. So Parliament had gone through the motions in many respects and used the rules and procedures with the guarantee of the ANC's majority, knowing that no real action would be taken. And it was only when the Gupta leaks came into the public domain in the middle of 2017 that Parliament sprang into action. The National Assembly then tasked 4 portfolio committees, Home Affairs, Mineral Resources, Public Enterprises and Transport, to engage with various ministers and to hold inquiries regarding allegations of state capture within those departments. I want to speak a little bit about the role of the Speaker of the National Assembly, because I think this is another important component of how Parliament has been weakened in recent years. I've mentioned already the re-election of the election of Baleka Mbete in 2014, when she held the position as chairperson of the ANC. The office of the Speaker is again established in terms of the Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't really elaborate on the role and function of the Speaker. That's something that is left for Parliament to decide and is dealt with in terms of the rules of Parliament. And those rules, as well as various court judgments that we now have provided guidance to us on understanding what the role of the Speaker is. And essentially, it provides that the role requires impartiality and neutrality, very much in line with the Westminster tradition on which our Parliament is, as I said earlier, based. The Speaker is tasked with maintaining order and discipline in the House, presiding over House meetings and debates, and has the final say in terms of the interpretation of the rules of the National Assembly. Yet we have seen on numerous occasions the Speaker appearing to be biased and partisan. In another case that went to court, that of Kluama, a member of Parliament for Achang, the applicants, being minority parties in the National Assembly, alleged that in August 2014, during a presidential Q&A session, obviously Zuma was president at the time, the Speaker protected the President from responding to questions in the House, did not permit follow-up questions, and ignored valid points of order that were raised, while allowing members of the governing party to address the House. 20 members of the EFF of Parliament from the EFF objected, and this ultimately led to their suspension from the National Assembly for periods ranging from 2 weeks to a month. Again in 2014, in September of that year, during another debate on a motion of no confidence in the Speaker, because as a result of all of this happening in Parliament, the opposition parties brought a motion of no confidence in Baleka Mbete. The Speaker remained in the House, took her seat, which is allocated to her in the Assembly, next to the Deputy President, observing the proceedings. It would have been appropriate for her to recuse herself and allow Parliament to deliberate on the matter in her absence. Just before that debate took place, she had addressed ANC supporters outside Parliament, on the just outside the perimeter, in an ANC capacity. And there were other incidents where the Speaker was clearly partisan, such as in January 2015, she was still the party's chairperson then, and she served in that position until the ANC National Conference in 2017. She attended the ANC's 103rd birthday celebration, which the ANC is now celebrating the 108th tomorrow in Kimberley. And at that occasion, which is clearly an ANC occasion, she used the occasion to publicly criticize members of opposition parties. That is conduct that is unbecoming of someone holding the position of the impartial chairperson of our foremost legislative assembly. Again, one can refer back to the opening of Parliament in February of 2015, when a signal jamming device, you'll recall, was used to prevent media broadcasting the State of the Nation address. The Speaker claimed to be unaware as to who authorized the signal jamming and so on. And it became apparent afterwards that there had been, the Speaker had abdicated responsibility for security to the Executive, to the Minister of State Security and others. And that was clearly a breach of the separation of powers. So in summary, what I'm saying is that the National Assembly, through the Speaker, shielded the President from oversight and accountability, and as a consequence, some of the decisions and conduct taken by Baleka Mbete were taken on review to the Constitutional Court, and those legal challenges were by and large successful. What all of this says to us, I think, is that the constitutional provisions which require Parliament to establish mechanisms to hold the national executive and organs of state to account has failed. And I think one can look at the electoral system in which we operate as an example of why this failure has come to pass. We have a closed list system of proportional representation, which means that there are no direct lines of political accountability between us and voters and people who are elected as members of Parliament. As I mentioned earlier, there's another provision of the Constitution which makes party political membership a prerequisite for one to become and remain a member of Parliament. The net effect of this is that members of Parliament are accountable and therefore beholden to their party bosses rather than to the electorate. And we've seen, as I've demonstrated with some examples, how the National Assembly in particular has been largely deferential to the executive in a number of instances. The electoral dominance of the governing party has, I believe, led to the blurring of the line between party and state, and this has fueled the governing party's deference to the executive in the National Assembly. In turn, the courts have become the site of significant political contestation in recent years. And I know that there's a session tomorrow morning, and I'm sure some of you will be at that, with Judge Dennis Davis and Advocate Michelle LaRue talking about their book Lawfare. And I'm sure they'll deal with this in much more and better detail than I ever could. But seeing the courts becoming the site of political contestation has begun to create the perception that the courts are interfering in the politics of the day through their judgments. And we see this, and the allegations that the judiciary is counter-majoritarian, that they're counter-revolutionaries, and that they're partisan, and they always fight against government. And, you know, whilst I don't believe any of that is true, repeated allegations of that nature can serve to ultimately undermine public confidence in the judiciary. Because it must be said that these cases, these so-called political cases that have gone before the courts, have only gone there because the National Assembly has failed to do its job, which is to resolve those political issues in Parliament and in other structures that the Constitution provides for. So what we saw in the Fifth Parliament was the entrenchment of this principle of majoritarianism to the exclusion of opposition parties. You may recall an instance in Parliament when President Zuma at the time said to opposition parties directly, "We are in the majority and therefore we have more rights than you." That's a clear breach of his constitutional responsibilities, clear breach of what the Constitution says in terms of promoting a multi-party democracy. Of course, at the end of the day, the majority will count, but there needs to be a process of engagement with opposition views, with minority views, before that happens. And we haven't been seeing that to the extent that I think the Constitution envisages. And this has contributed ultimately to poor oversight over the executive and organs of state, in turn allowing state capture to flourish, because we know that ministers were not held accountable. The nuclear deal would be another example where the government department and minister refused to answer questions in Parliament around this, claiming confidentiality and the like. And ultimately, it was only when another NGO, SAFSI, took the matter to the court that the Western Cape High Court ruled that the deal would be unlawful and unconstitutional and required Parliament to review its processes. So without the intervention of the courts, things might have been much worse than they have in fact been. Ultimately, the National Assembly's inability to effectively discharge its oversight mandate has resulted in a weakening of Parliament as a pillar of our democracy. As I said right at the beginning, within our system of constitutional democracy, Parliament sits at the very center of it. And if Parliament becomes weak and ineffective, ultimately the rest of the system is weakened as a result. So the question that arises then is what needs to be done to fix Parliament? There are no easy answers to this, I don't think, but I think some of the answers that we need to look at have been around for some time. I referred earlier to an oversight and accountability model that Parliament itself put into place in 2004. And that model was to a certain extent premised on a report that was prepared by Professor Hugh Corder, who's just retired from this university. He was assisted by Saras Jagwant and Fred Soltau, a report that he prepared for Parliament when I was still working for the Speaker in July of 1999, just before I left Parliament. We had commissioned Professor Corder to look at how we could, within the constitutional framework and the rule of Parliament, strengthen Parliament's oversight capacity over the executive. And remember, this was in the good old days of Parliament when things were working pretty well, but we still felt that we needed to fine-tune and strengthen Parliament's ability to exercise oversight. When Parliament put out its position in 2004, however, they overlooked almost all of the recommendations that Professor Corder and his team had made. And I believe that some of those are now worth resuscitating. And the key recommendation that Professor Corder made in that report is that, remember I said just now that unlike the Westminster system, Parliament's oversight mandate is entrenched in our Constitution. Professor Corder was suggesting that we should go one step further and enshrine this in law and expand upon it and say exactly what we mean about parliamentary oversight and how it should be conducted. And he proposed that there should be a piece of legislation called an Accountability Standards Act, which exists in some other jurisdictions. I think New Zealand is one, that directs MPs to exercise their oversight functions effectively and properly, and providing a legal basis for them to do so. And this would actually help members of the ruling party as well, because at the moment, as I said, because of the electoral system, the power of the party bosses, they're afraid to step out of line. But if they can point to a piece of legislation that says, the law requires me to do this, there's very little the party bosses can then do to try and hold them to account or pull them into line. So it would serve a dual purpose in that regard. The act that he proposes would introduce a concept of what he refers to as a mandatory accountability. In other words, meaning that there should be remedial action that is attached to when members of the executive or organs of state step out of line, where they are found to have breached their responsibilities. He says that this will ensure that there are consequences for maladministration, and that by Parliament being able to take remedial action, it will ensure that when wrongful things are pointed out, action is taken to correct them. In the same way as we now know that the remedial action of the public protector is legally binding on its subject, so too would parliamentary positions of the same nature be binding on members of the executive. And his argument was that this Accountability Standards Act should mirror the provisions of the Public Finance Management Act, the PFMA, which basically deals with the public servants, directors general and the like, and holds them liable for financial misconduct and maladministration. And he says in the same way, this Accountability Standards Act should hold members of the executive and representatives of organs of state similarly liable, including being criminally liable for acts of financial misconduct and corruption. There were a range of other proposals in Professor Corder's report, which I think we need to review and revisit because they make a lot of sense now in the light of the experience we've had over the last few years. I'm not going to go into any of those now because they're outside of the ambit of what I want us to focus on today, except to say that one of the things that he focuses on in that report is how to strengthen the independence and effectiveness of Chapter 9 institutions. And I think, again, that's something that Parliament needs to review. I would propose that to ensure political impartiality at all times, that the rules of the National Assembly should be amended to clearly specify that any person elected as Speaker of the National Assembly should not be allowed to hold office within any political party. I think that's something, I think, we don't want to go to the Westminster system because where, once you become Speaker, you resign the party whip and, your seat is safe, it's uncontested and the like. I don't think we need to go down that road. I think our constitution and our model of democracy is very different. But I think holding office within a particularly senior office within a political party certainly undermines the perception of independence that we have or that we should have in the office of the Speaker. That they can continue to be members of the political party and participate in party activities, I wouldn't have a problem with, but holding senior office is something I would. Linked to that is something else I want to draw to your attention, in that in the early years of Parliament, certainly from 1994, I think all the way up until 2014, so aside from the Speaker of the National Assembly and the Deputy Speaker, you have a range of other presiding officers, chairpersons of committees and the like. And there's always been at least one opposition MP amongst that presidium, who would sometimes sit and chair meetings, plenary meetings in the National Assembly. And again, that gave the impression of a vibrant multi-party democracy where it's not just the majority party that occupies all the positions. And I think a reversion to that practice would assist in building a healthier culture of debate within Parliament, and I hope it's something that will be re-looked at. Similarly, when it comes to issues of the chairpersons of parliamentary committees themselves, as we know, those parliamentary committees play a key role in oversight. And again, traditionally, and this again draws largely from the Westminster model, it is only the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, SCOPA, that has a chairperson that is drawn from outside of the governing party. I would suggest that the chairpersonship should be appointed from all parties represented in Parliament, according to a proportional formula, so the ANC would still have the majority of the chairs, but that you would have some committees that are chaired by members of opposition parties. And I think, again, this creates and seeks, to me, would seek to fulfill the vision of the Constitution of creating a vibrant multi-party democracy. And, it would counter the majoritarian domination that we have seen in recent years. So coming back to the issue of electoral reform, we'll recall that in 2002, Cabinet appointed a task team that was chaired by Dr. Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert. And that task team was responsible for formulating new electoral laws for the 2004 elections and beyond. And they proposed a hybrid system in which there would be 300 members of the National Assembly elected from constituencies and 100 from a pure PR system as a top-up. And those 300 from a constituency system wouldn't be on a single-member constituency like in the UK and other single-member constituencies, but on a multi-member constituency. So I think they proposed we had 69 constituencies that would elect 300 people, and then the other 100 would be topped up on a pure PR basis. And it would create an open list system where voters would be able to select a party and then rank candidates in the order of their preference. That hybrid model, as we know, was rejected by Cabinet. It never went to Parliament. The report has to this date not been debated in Parliament. We know now that similar calls for a review of the electoral systems have been made in 2009 by an independent panel that reviewed the functioning of Parliament that was put in place by the then Speaker of Parliament, Max Sisulu. And then we had the former President Kgalema Motlante's high-level panel report in 2017, which also advocated for a review of the electoral system. Despite all of this, we still have had no discussion by Parliament on any of these issues relating to electoral reform. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that electoral reform would be a panacea or a silver bullet that would miraculously deliver accountable government to us. Electoral reform, I think, has to go hand in hand with a change in our political culture, and that means us, you and I, holding our representatives to account. But the reality is that we fail to do that at a local government level, even now, where we have constituency-based ward councillors. Ward committees that are supposed to exist hardly function. So if we are going to change the political system, it's going to need a change in our political culture to give meaning to what the Constitution refers to as a participatory democracy, which is not about going and casting our vote once every 5 years, but taking a much more active role in holding our elected members to account. A couple of final points that I want to make, one relating to Parliament. As we've seen, much of the state capture within state organs, state-owned enterprises and the like was enabled by key individuals within those institutions. And therefore it is recommended that Parliament should create public participation and oversight mechanisms for key appointments to some of those public offices. And I referred right at the beginning to the NPA, to the Hawks, SAPS, SARS. One can add to that the Financial Intelligence Centre, and I'm sure there are 2 or 3 others that we could add. And I think it's important that we review and revamp the method of appointment of the heads of those institutions, because they're critical to the functioning of an effective and accountable system of government. We saw just over a year ago President Ramaphosa institute a new system for appointing the head of the NPA. He appointed a panel of independent people to conduct the interviews and make a recommendation to him. That is something we would like to see entrenched in law, so that a future president would be compelled to follow that example or a similar example to that. But it needs to be an open and transparent and competitive process. So we have no idea how any other National Director of Public Prosecutions, from Bulelani Nguka being the first, to Vusi Piccoli, to Sean Abrams, we have no idea what process was followed for any of them to be appointed. We now know how Shamila Batoy was appointed. And whether we agree with her appointment or not, we know how that decision was reached. And I think similar processes should be put in place by Parliament for these other key officers, because it would help with with securing the independence of those incumbents, as well as instilling public confidence in those individuals that hold that office, to know that they're not handpicked by the president or a cabinet minister, but they've gone through an open, competitive process where they've had to prove their worth before the eyes of the nation. The final recommendation that I want to touch on, and I'm not going to deal with this in any detail, but I'm really just going to refer to it, and it's something that CASAC is going to put out a paper on in a couple of months from now probably, is to argue that we need to have a dedicated and independent anti-corruption agency. The Hawks are clearly not fit for purpose as a corruption-fighting entity. Being located within the police, being subject to police hierarchy and the like, undermines any pretense at independence within that institution. Even though there's a very good head, General Libya at the Hawks at the moment, he is constrained by the fact that he has to operate within the environment in which the Hawks is located. So we would argue very strongly that given the scale and magnitude of corruption that we have faced and are facing in South Africa, it cannot be business as usual. You can't just say that by replacing the head of the NPA, replacing the head of the Hawks, we're dealing with corruption. We need to have a much more interventionist approach, which I believe means establishing a standalone, truly independent agency with sufficient resources given to it that is accountable to Parliament, in order to really hold people to account and ensure that those who commit wrongdoing are actually held to account. In conclusion, I want to say that the Constitution, I believe, was stress tested during the Zuma years. And ultimately, it was only with the support of an independent judiciary that it survived those tests. In view of the weaknesses that state capture has allowed us to identify within our constitutional architecture, I think we owe it to future generations to ensure that the Constitution, the framework of the Constitution, is fortified to prevent future attacks on our democracy. Thanks, and I'm happy to take questions. Any comments, questions?
So can I just ask you about, you talked about the hold that the party needs to have over individuals in Parliament. At one no confidence debate just before Zuma retired, the Speaker allowed a secret ballot. Could you just give some background on that? Because I mean, that obviously clearly indicated that a group of ANC MPs did not vote for Zuma, that they couldn't be identified, they couldn't be expelled from the National Assembly.
So what happened in that case was that I think it was the UDM that asked the Speaker to conduct the motion of no confidence through a secret ballot. She said she was unable to do so. They then went to court, brought an application before the Constitutional Court to clarify the issue. The court ruled basically that the Speaker had the option of conducting a motion of no confidence either by secret ballot or through an open ballot. And the court deliberated on the issue, deliberated on the fact that in the case, for example, where there is a contestation for the election of a president, it's conducted by secret ballot. So the court said, well, if you elect a president by secret ballot, why shouldn't you have a motion of no confidence by the same mechanism? So it basically said it was up to Parliament to decide, but it provided some guidelines as to how the Speaker should exercise that discretion as to whether to opt for a secret ballot or not. And in that context, it reflected on the issues that because of the electoral system that we have, because of the power of political parties, that members may not be able to properly exercise their minds and their ballots if it were an open vote and it could be seen how they voted. So the court gave the Speaker the option, and she ultimately decided to hold that the very final motion of no confidence against Zuma through a secret ballot. And we know that about 25 to 30 ANC MPs must have voted against, given the numbers that were there, but they were not able to be identified, although it's quite likely that the ANC would have known who at least some of them were. But I think there was a message in the judgment of the court saying that if any action were to be taken against a member who voted against or in favour of the motion of no confidence, they might have some legal recourse through the courts to protect them from being